I think we're going to get started now. Hope you guys can hear me. I'm Tara Michelle Zinnick, and I am the editor of this magazine currently. And I want to thank you all for your patience as we were getting things sorted out at the beginning here. And thank you all for coming. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge that while we have participants and attendees from across what is currently commonly referred to as Canada, that the land this magazine's offices are located on is the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of the land. This land is currently home to a diverse urban Indigenous community, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land as guests. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this magazine, we are an independent print publication. We also publish some of our content online from the print magazine. We have been publishing for 55 years, which is a very long time in independent publishing. We started as a radical education journal, and we are now a bi-monthly magazine of progressive politics, arts, and culture. We run themed and open issues, reported pieces, essays, personal journalism, opinion, and culture writing. We feature emerging and experienced Canadian writers, including fiction writers and poets, and with a focus on new writers and writers who face barriers to the traditional publishing industry. We publish on a wide variety of topics, including labor, climate justice, Indigenous identity, and then our culture writing can be anything from racism in cartoons to talking about why people who dislike cops like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. We currently have our May-June issue on stands. It is about housing and homes, connecting to today's events. It includes features on barrier-free housing in Canada, the intersections of domestic violence and affordable housing, and multi-generational living. Our next two issues are going to be about the future, largely about the post-pandemic future. That's September, October. And after that, we're doing our annual culture issue, which is about pop culture this year, and that's our November, December issue. A quick intro to this talk series, and then I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for today's event. In fall of 2018, this magazine launched We Need to Talk About This, our national talk series. We held events in Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Halifax, Montreal, and Toronto. Each city featured a different topic ranging from mental health to racism in Canada's healthcare system and included a diverse range of speakers. The talk series was on hiatus in 2020, but has just been relaunched with this virtual event where we'll be talking about Canada's housing crisis. Each of our events has one big question, and the big question we're asking today is, how do we respond to a broken system that has left the country's most vulnerable to fend for themselves? I'm going to hand it over now to our moderator, Geordie Dent. Geordie is the executive director of the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations and has been a tenant advocate in Indonesia, Norway, Vancouver, and Toronto.
Hi, folks. As Tara Michelle mentioned, my name is Geordie. I'd like to start by introducing our speakers. We had three scheduled for today, but we're still trying to hunt down one. So I'll just intro two of them right now, and if we're able to get our third to pop up, we will introduce them. So to start off with background in law, Karine-Myrgianie Jean-François has worked in the community sector in feminist and or youth-oriented organizations for over 10 years. Born in Tyee, this Black queer woman supports minoritized communities in their liberation. She's currently the Director of Operations and Projects at the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, also known as Dawn Canada. This eternal optimist believes in the power of communities and knows that we as folks that are always put at the margins have the power to change our world. Another speaker that we have today is Jen St. Denis, who's a staff writer for the Tyee, an independent news magazine based in Vancouver, where she covers the downtown East Side neighborhood. She previously reported on housing and city politics for CTV News, the Star Vancouver, Metro News, and Business in Vancouver. Her work has also appeared in the Toronto Star and the South China Morning Post. I wanted to start with just a few comments on the state of housing in Canada. You know, I live in Toronto. A number of this magazine folks are in Toronto. And after the last election in Toronto for Mayor John Tory spoke kind of at a conference I was at around housing, saying that in his previous election, transit was the number one issue he heard at the door, but after the last election, the number one issue he heard at the door was housing. And I think pretty much everyone on the call and everyone in Canada specifically those that live in a large Canadian city, will know that there's been a marked shift in the cost and difficulty in finding housing in many Canadian cities in recent years. And for some populations, it's just been bad for a long time. This isn't actually only a Canadian phenomenon. Sweden's prime minister just lost the confidence vote in Sweden for the first time, and it was said to be related to the spiraling cost of housing. And what we're seeing is housing costs exploding across the globe in multiple different communities. And, you know, we sometimes talk about housing in this kind of cerebral, macroeconomic way, but there are tremendous impacts that this have. Today in Toronto, Trinity Bellwoods Park, there's about 100 security and police officers together that are trying to clear out a large encampment through forcible eviction. People are getting pepper sprayed, a large tent community that's being dismantled. So this has a strong human cost. We're gonna be getting some presentations from our presenters. We're gonna have some Q&As, but there's a couple of dates that are important to keep in mind when we talk about these broad trends in housing. In 1992, the federal government got out of broad supply programs they were using to build housing. And in 1993, Canada got its first real estate investment trust. So whenever I'm talking about housing, I kind of remind people that this was the date that housing went from being part of infrastructure like roads and schools and hospitals to being more of a financial investment. The second date that I think is important to keep in mind is 2010. That was right after the US housing crisis, which was largely a real estate crisis. And that's when, in a lot of the activists I've talked to around the world, housing markets across the globe started to go a little haywire. With that 5 minutes, I'd like to give each panelist 10 minutes to talk about their current area of expertise. Why don't we start with the first person we introed, Karine-Myrgianie Jean-François, the Director of Operations and Projects at the Disabled Women's Network of Canada in Montreal.
Bonjour, hello. As was mentioned, I live in Montreal. I'm on the territory of the Karine-Myrgianie people, and I'm really sorry, I was not speaking, right? You did not hear anything I just said?
Sorry about that, Karine-Myrgianie. Yeah, if you could start again, that'd be great. Apologies.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction. I was talking about the territory. I was saying that I live in Montreal indeed, which is Karine-Myrgianie territory, or Geordie or Munyang. And while it's also been a place where people have traveled to and from, and has been a space of trade and meeting of different nations, because that's what rivers are for. I'm really glad that Karine-Myrgianie people are still there and protecting the waters, the skies, and the earth. I'm always reminded as a Francophone that I did not very know about Indigenous people here growing up, even though the Oka crisis happened when I was young. It was kind of old-fashioned. But I really appreciate the work that they've been doing to keep their community safe, especially in this pandemic, and also to keep us all settlers and people who have been brought here to be safe. I work at the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. We're 35 years old, and we're a women with disabilities and deaf women advocacy organization. We work and we believe that women are both cis and trans, and we're slowly expanding our understanding of what womanhood means to understand more gender and disability in a broader sense, to include our non-binary siblings and two-spirit siblings as well that are part of our communities, but I do not identify as women. We've been working for 35 years on making sure that the leadership and expertise of women with disabilities is recognized at decision-making tables, to also do the work that's needed to understand the different realities of women with disabilities across this really big country. For the last 35 years, as are kind of unique because there's very few people who do work around gender and disability. We've been working the last couple of years more specifically around education and research, as well as advocacy and our public policy reform. Because we believe that if people do not know the important issues that 24% of all women in Canada experience, according to StatsCan, then things can change. And if people are not educated about those things, then it's really hard for our common human rights that all of us have, but some of us are harder to get respected, also experience, and as well as to change policies. So lives are easier. Often we'll talk about ableism, and I'll come back a little bit about how ableism is often something we don't talk when we talk of the cute isms. But it's really important to understand that it makes a big difference for people who experience both misogyny and ableism, as well as other systems of oppression. And so we work through an intersectional lens, as well as a cross disability lens. And what that means is that often when we think about disabilities, we think about someone using a wheelchair. And that is a certain kind of disability. A motor disability is a physical disability that requires mobility aid. But disability is also being autistic. It's also having a developmental disabilities. It's also about mental health. It's also about sensitive, multi-sensitive, environments. So a lot of people, and that's mostly women, who can't actually be in spaces where there's a lot of fragrance, for example. It actually disables their way of living. And we also always made the difference between deaf and disabled because that's what we've been asked to do by deaf women. And so when I think about cross disability and I think about housing, it's really important to realize that there's a lot of precarious housing and homelessness, and I'll kind of intertwine them, but try to stick more to housing. And to think about that 46% of women who are homeless are actually women with disabilities. And probably the number would be higher if people actually responded. Because a big part of the disability that's often unreported is around traumatic brain injury. And 40% of all Ontario women in Ontario prisons actually were diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries that happened before they were actually incarcerated and before their first crime, but did not even know about it even until some research team showed up at the prisons and tested that for traumatic brain injury. So we know the number is higher. And it's really important to think that when we think about housing, that it's both affordable, safe, and adequate. And what that means is that for some people that might need that, it means that they need support at home. That may mean that they need lower counters. It may mean as well that they need someone to be there to cook for them, or to clean, or to lift them, or to help them take a shower or a bath. And when we think especially, that's not usually the case. And in a lot of provinces, including the one that I live, when people require too many support at home or too many hours of support, people are usually sent to long-term care homes. And that's the way that people are institutionalized and are not necessarily choosing where they want to live and how they want to live. And for us, housing it's not only a right, but it's something that you should be able to choose. And yes, I know, as probably a lot of you know, that there's been a lot of housing costs has risen a lot in the last couple of years, especially in big urban centers, but as well as like smaller towns. But that's also the case when we think about women with disabilities also in general make less money, are less employed, and because they're usually less educated, because the system gives up on them. And when we think about all of this being ableism, a systemic ableism, it kind of makes sense that for a lot of women with disability, housing is hard and is not possible. And that's why there's a lot of hidden homelessness often, or actually homelessness that we see in shelters and encampments, or sometimes staying at their parents, even though they want to move out. And I'm thinking especially of women with learning disabilities or mental health disabilities, because it's easier, because they get the support that they need that maybe would not be supplied or provided by our health authorities, even though they should, because that's the way that they know that they will have everything they need. And that fits usually what's affordable, safe, and adequate, but not their choice. It's also really important to realize that for a lot of different population, and I think especially of trans young women with disabilities, homelessness is the way of life. Being kicked out of your family family's house because they're trans, not being able to find employment because they're trans, or maybe being able to find some kind of employment but not finding housing that fits your autistic needs makes it different, makes it very difficult. I'm also thinking about Indigenous women, as well as racialized women or immigrant and refugee women with disabilities that often are refused by tenants, by landlords, sorry, who don't want people who are too different, who are scared that it's going to be complicated. And especially for deaf women, often landlords will believe that perhaps they won't hear something, and maybe because of them, their building, there will be a fire in the building. Even though there are other ways for them to know when there's smoke and when it's dangerous and things need to happen. Um, Again, we're talking about something that's affordable, safe, and adequate. What's adequate for me and what's adequate for someone else may not be the same. And I think that often when we talk about housing and we talk about the lack of housing, we often forget that a lot of people live in housing that's not actually adequate for them, but it's the housing that they have. And that's often the case for people who have degenerative diseases such as multiple sclerosis or fibromyalgia. And that's usually affect mostly women, who are adult women. And what happens is that their house might have been okay for a while. They could go up and down the stairs, or they could do dishes standing up. But at some point, the aspect of the degenerative disease makes it that it's no longer accessible. They need to be seated to do dishes. They might not be able to go up and down the stairs. And yet they stay in this home because it's better than not having a home. And often what we hear when we talk to other women with disabilities or people who work with other women with disabilities and deaf women is that housing is such a challenge because there's no navigation, there's no support to finding housing that is both affordable, safe, and adequate, and that is close to the supports that people are needed to function in their everyday life. And especially for those who are on welfare or ODSP or whatever your Ontario disability, yeah, it's ODSP, is, then the amount that they get is not enough to actually allow them to find a place that is close to where their support organizations or care stuff is happening. And then often they might end up being homeless or being placed in some kind of group home, long-term care home, or other kind of institutions that they did not choose. And that really is the case of what happens to a lot of people. And when we think about this housing need, and especially post-pandemic, well, we're not quite post-pandemic yet, but notice how those group homes and long-term care homes have been especially affected by COVID-19. And to think that we're just sending people there because we don't have any homes makes hard. It makes it hard, and we need to change our policies and the way that both this thing that we call the private market of housing, but also the way that we envision living changes. So more women with disabilities and deaf women, as well as non-binary people, can have access to chosen, affordable, safe, and adequate housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karine-Myrgianie. Really appreciate those comments. I'm going to have some questions for you in the Q&A, and just a reminder for folks that we will have a Q&A after our next speaker. Looking to get into some meaty questions that either I have or you have. You, of course, have some precedents, so get those questions in later on when you're able to do so. Up next, we're going to have Jen St. Denis, who's a journalist from Vancouver who now writes for the Tyee. Jen, take us off.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm just going to go through my kind of journey and how I first started to report on housing. I was working at a business magazine called Business in Vancouver, and it was back in 2015. And we just started to notice that housing prices were just skyrocketing. We were using words like red hot and flaming and that kind of thing in our newspaper headlines. And we were really reporting on it as just sort of a business story. But I was hearing from a lot of small business employers at the time that it was really starting to affect them, that because their workers weren't able to find housing in the city. And so I started to report on it as more of a sort of in a wider way, as sort of a social issue that was affecting small businesses, that was affecting a lot of the workers in a really damaging way. And then as I continued to report through 2015, the housing prices just kept on going. In some cases, some areas, there was like a 40% year-over-year increase. And it was just a really historic moment in Vancouver real estate, which has always been a little bit crazy. But this was just really off the charts. And it really was, it went from being like, oh, wow, look how much I made on selling my, my West End house that I've lived in for 30 years to, oh my gosh, this is actually kind of pulling the city apart and it's actually damaging the city. And then I moved to another newspaper that was more general interest, the Metro, which was like a daily commuter paper. And I started to report more on homelessness because what was happening at that time was it wasn't just real estate prices that were zooming upward. Rents were also rising a whole bunch. And then we also started to see homelessness rising. And that was really scary because in Vancouver, we'd had a city council that had really focused on lowering homelessness, that had focused on housing people. And they'd had success. They'd actually, over a 10-year period, they'd managed to make homeless rates go down. And then all of a sudden in 2016, that progress was reversed and homelessness was increasing again. And it was also unusual to have real estate prices affect the rental market. Usually those are not linked. And in this case, they were. So it was a really serious crisis that was affecting all these levels, like right from the top, from the luxury market down to sort of like middle-class housing, condos, and then down to renters and homelessness as well. And we sort of saw it go through the entire like real estate ecosystem. So we saw a lot of interesting government interventions at the time. We saw a lot of focus on the demand side. So a lot of focus on foreign investors, a lot of new taxes that were targeting not only just offshore money, but also speculation in the marketplace. A lot of examination of how many empty homes do we have in the province? What role is Airbnb playing? And a lot of like policy interventions at both the provincial level and the city level. And we really started to see those policy interventions have an immediate effect on especially the luxury market. And so, throughout the sort of 2017, 2018 period, I was writing a lot about, the kind of deflating luxury home market. And it was just these multi-million-dollar homes that people were no longer able to sell. And they were kind of just sitting on the market. And there were things like, some of them were being foreclosed on. And so that was the kind of reporting. It's been really interesting to watch through the COVID-19 pandemic, though, because what we thought, housing prices in Vancouver have been decoupled from incomes for so long. The housing prices in Vancouver do not have any relation to the actual incomes that local, workers make in Vancouver, even on the highest end. They're completely separated. And so we thought that the COVID-19 pandemic would have this effect on the real estate market. And I remember CMHC kind of predicting this, that we would see housing prices fall. But instead we've seen the exact opposite. And it's been a bit of a mini blip again in housing prices zooming upwards. So now I'm focused on the downtown east side neighborhood of Vancouver in my reporting for the Tyee. And so in that role, the downtown east side neighborhood is, one of Vancouver's poorest neighborhoods. A lot of people there who are really struggling, a lot of people who are racialized, a lot of Indigenous people living there. And so I'm really focused more on the lower end and how social housing is kind of fitting into the real estate market now. There has been a push by both the federal government and the province to build more social housing, because there is this recognition that we stopped building social housing in the 80s and especially in the 90s, and we also stopped building a lot of new rental housing. And both of those things had such a huge impact. We do have this supply glut. So recently, the province and federal government and the city have all been trying to build more social housing. But we're kind of seeing that it's just really, really hard to build enough housing to meet the demand. And then with the COVID-19 pandemic, just like we're seeing in Toronto, in Vancouver, we've had tent cities for a really long time, but we've seen tent cities kind of move around and grow. We've seen homelessness grow during COVID-19 pandemic. And so it's sort of similar to the era in the 2016 moment where we kind of saw this like huge price spike shake the entire real estate market. In this case, we're seeing COVID-19 kind of increase homelessness, but also like a little mini like housing price bubble go up. And it's another like shake to our system to really, really reveal like how broken it is and how it just really can't respond to something like, you know, homelessness increasing because of a pandemic. And things like people being worried about going into shelters because they're worried that they'll get COVID-19. We're sort of seeing that there's no real other option other than like quickly maybe buying an industrial building or leasing a hotel and kind of quickly retrofitting it so people can go into it and be out of the tent city. So that's where I'm focused right now. And yeah, it's just, but it's never, there's never a dull moment in Vancouver real estate. There's always just something new happening, and it's been really hard to predict like what's going to happen next.
Thank you, Jen. We're kind of right on schedule at this time. We were looking to get to a Q&A by about 3:40, 3:45 and wrap up at 4. Q&A options open, should be open on your webinar functions. Did anyone from this need to kind of give a primer on that, or is it already self-explanatory?
We don't need to do anything. It's open and people can type in their questions. Yeah, in the Q&A box.
Thanks, folks. So, you know, I do have some primer questions to start with. I was hoping to start with you, Karine-Myrgianie. Mostly, you know, I mentioned kind of at the top that there's really this feeling that there's been a change in the housing market when I talk to folks in you know, Toronto and Vancouver and even Montreal. But it's only when I talk to specific folks. You know, when I talk to a lot of Indigenous communities, they're like, no, it's been abysmal for us for, you know, decades. And when I talk to folks that often need supportive housing or barrier-free housing, they kind of say the same thing. They're like, welcome to the show. You know, like it's a disaster for you now. Now you know what it's been like for the rest of us for, again, decades. And I'm wondering, you know, has there been a noted change for you, or is the supply for the kind of populations you work with been so low anyways?
There hasn't been that many changes, actually, because as Jen mentioned, we haven't been building social housing. It's up to basically private owners when they're building new buildings to decide or to retrofit older buildings with accessibility features, and they usually don't. And so what that means is that the only way to get, like, let's say you're a deaf person or someone who uses a wheelchair, to get a fully accessible place, ideally you have the money to buy your own place and then fit it with what you need. And yes, there are subsidies in various provinces, but in order, you need to pay everything in advance and you'll get some of that money back. And so there hasn't been that much change. And because we have a growing older population, who also wants things like ground floors with not too many steps. And that means that actually they're actually less than there used to be, and they were already not a lot. I remember when my aunt had a mess, and when she died, you know, our daughter was living there, had to move very quickly because this was one of the few fully accessible housing, because she used a wheelchair and had like the lift by her bathtub and everything. And so basically her living daughter had to be kicked out really quickly because this was an accessible unit, and that was one of the few that they had in the whole island.
Thanks. We've got some Q&As here. I'm going to do one more prep with Jen before I get to them. And Jen, you had kind of talked kind of at the beginning around your work that you've been doing now with kind of tent city trends. And kind of before the panel began, we were talking a little bit about how you maybe felt the trends of what's happening in Toronto today, where you've got kind of encampments in almost every major urban park in Ontario. are different to what you're seeing in Vancouver. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can talk about what I'm seeing in Vancouver, and I have a sense that it's a little bit different, but the trends are the same. And we've been seeing this in Metro Vancouver for years, that we're seeing more and more encampments in, sometimes in parks, sometimes in just sort of like industrial areas where people maybe are not like looking so hard for the tents. In Vancouver, we've had tent cities, like we've had a tent city be located in a park or some other lot since like 2014. It's gone on for years and years and years. And there's kind of this playbook where we try, there's a BC Supreme Court decision that says you can't kick someone out of the park unless they have shelter. And so what they do just over and over again is clear a bunch of rooms, usually in shelters and SRO hotels, which are like single room occupancy hotels in Vancouver. They'll clear a bunch of spaces and then they offer them to people, give them a couple of rounds of choices, and then after most of the people are housed, then they kind of move in and clear the park, and they just do this over and over again. So I'm not sure if that's the same as in Toronto. I think in Toronto there's been more COVID outbreaks in shelters. Am I correct on that? We haven't really had that in Vancouver. And so I think when people are saying like, I'm afraid to go to a hotel or I'm afraid to go to a shelter because of the risk of getting COVID-19, I can understand why people are really fearing that in Toronto, because there actually have been outbreaks. So in Vancouver, we also like the government's cleared tent cities in Victoria and Vancouver early in the pandemic. They were encampments that had been there for a while, but they used COVID-19 as kind of the excuse to finally get them out of the parks. And, to be fair, these were like very, very large encampments that had took over like an entire park in Vancouver, for instance, and had made it so that people in the downtown east side community could no longer really use that park as a park. So there's no question that it was kind of a problem, but they kind of went in and did the thing where they eventually clear it and then put up blue fencing, which I think we're seeing in Toronto as well. This tactic of just fencing the entire park off. And Oppenheimer Park is still closed a year later, by the way. So during COVID-19, when park access was really, really important, and when people in the downtown east side either don't have homes themselves or are living in these tiny SRO rooms, they didn't have access to this really important park. So after that, the encampment actually moved to another park, to Strathcona Park, and it was there for most of the pandemic. And it was really large. It was about 200 tents. And it's just, there's never services provided. There's always a question of like, there's always a scramble to like provide, there's like never enough toilets. And in Strathcona Park, they didn't put any extra toilets in. People were having trouble getting water. It's very basic things, but there's this fear that if you make the park too comfy for people, I guess, with like basic services, that they'll stay there. And so we just had this happen in Strathcona, where this process happened again, where they get all the rooms, get all the shelter spots, and then do this process again, where they clear it. And now the park is all fenced off with the blue fencing. So it's just this process that happens over and over and over again, just sort of like an endless cycle. And whether the question is like, maybe at this point, do we need like a sanctioned spot that does have services? I don't know, but it just seems to be this really intransient problem.
Thanks, Jen. I don't know if that would actually be too far off from what we're seeing in Toronto. Probably the difference is the lack of SRO stock. Although during COVID, the city did try to buy a number of failing hotels, or hotels kind of that try to buy space in them.
Yeah.
Although I think that was in the neighborhood of like 1,500, and the population of the homeless population just exploded to such a degree because
so it was
they
really a
tried
drop
to
in the
do.
bucket.
Pardon?
It was really a drop in the bucket of what they needed to do. I actually think this move to buy or lease hotel space was actually really interesting and positive. Like we actually saw governments move really, really quickly to do that, which we haven't seen that in the past, to just say, we're buying an entire hotel and it's going to be homeless housing for, or housing for people who are homeless. It's going to be that for the next foreseeable future. We saw that in Vancouver and in other BC cities. And I actually thought it was a really positive move. Although, as you're saying, we need more units. It's never enough.
Part of the problem was that the traditional like numbers in Toronto, which might be around 10,000, we're all of a sudden hit with a lot of the hidden homeless. So you're not couch surfing during a pandemic as easily as you were before. So all of a sudden you had this large wave of numbers, which was being dealt with, that I think stopped. And I don't think even the city really, in Toronto at least, even has a handle on the number. There was no like census or study of how many encampments we were looking at. They were just everywhere.
Do they know? Do they know how many homeless? Do they do a homeless count every year?
I don't think they did last year.
Okay.
But they do normally, yeah.
But homeless counts, I mean, in Montreal gave something like 3,000 people. And, you know, if you think about the shelters and how used they are, there are more than 3,000 people just in the shelter system.
It's always
that doesn't even count the people that are outside that are roughing it up. The hotels was not such a success here because they like made people sleep in, you know, with someone else in their room sometimes. There was no door in the bathrooms. You didn't pick who was going to be your roommate for the night. And it was basically security guards were patrolling. There was usually no necessarily staff from shelters or people who've worked with homeless people. So it was kind of like more of a policing experience than anything else. And so that was not very positive for most people. And also a lot of the shelters, especially men's shelters, women's shelters were better because they usually had rooms for 2 people or 1. But men's shelters are mostly like dormitory styles. And so it was harder for them to keep them fully open. We didn't have as many cases as Toronto did within the shelter system though. But there were a lot of cases within the Inuit population, the Inuit homeless population in Montreal. And because of that, someone actually died because things were closed at night because we had a curfew. And he died in a bathroom just next to the day center he usually was at after they closed because of curfew. And so it was not quite a success what happened, especially Indigenous people did not, especially the Inuit population did not trust to go to the hotels, and women as well. And there was actually violence because people had to line up and then they were thrown out really early in the morning as well, and had to go through some steps that were not necessarily pleasant with security guards that were rude and did not really get what being homeless was about, or were not necessarily kind to people.
We've got a couple questions. Thank you for those comments, by the way. I think it's interesting to see just kind of how the overlap in each city is there and where the differences are. I hope we can get through a couple of questions. So I'd like to start with, I'm going to say the question, but I'll kind of tweak it a little bit. So one person is wondering if they see the move to more remote work by large companies as something that could be good for community housing. I believe thinking that maybe the like vacated large sites could then be like converted into community housing if you had a lot of, for example, large commercial space lying around. Karine-Myrgianie, first of all, I was wondering, you know, I know there is some history of this in Montreal with like large factories being kind of converted to housing kind of units or commercial spaces being converted. But I'm going to kind of ask that question to Jen directly, but for you, I'm also wondering like, what, you know, do you think this is doable for kind of housing for folks with disabilities? Or do you think like there's something very specific that needs to happen that just isn't happening in order to kind of meet the needs for housing?
I mean, that's a really interesting thing, having this idea of like commercial buildings being used for residential use. What has happened in the last couple of years is all those factories became really fancy condos. They're basically condo buildings. And so that's not quite a thing. There are some that became more for housing and that are affordable-ish, but they're usually they usually get converted from big factories that are unused to condo buildings. I would also say that usually those spaces are never accessible. So I don't think for me, that would be the way that I would go. I think that there's a need for social housing, like we have cooperatives that can be accessible. The only problem is usually they're not. The National Housing Strategy did say that about a quarter of the new social housing or affordable housing that should be created with the money that they put in should be accessible. Because if about 25% of the population has a disability, about 25% of the population, so a quarter, should be able to, have access to something that's accessible. The reality is that each province is doing their own thing. So for example, some provinces like the one I live in Quebec chose that it was not a priority. And so the new buildings, the new social housing buildings that will be built will not necessarily be accessible to people, or maybe they will do one that is not fully accessible because they, are trying to just do it for cheaper or like less time. So that is definitely one reality. And I would say that right now it doesn't seem for Montreal anyways that even though there'll be more remote work, people will still have to go to the office. And so most of those office spaces are still being occupied. I mean downtown, which is where right now it's empty.
Jen, what about you? I know that kind of old industrial sites like False Creek have been big issues for years in Vancouver,
Yeah.
but I don't know if there's any kind of change you think that's happening around that, or if it's all going to condos as well. So.
Yeah, this actually happened during the pandemic. There was a large department store called Army and Navy that was it has been in the downtown East Side area for over 100 years. It's this just big brick building that's kind of like an expanse, as you can imagine, like a department store. So it really had trouble during the COVID-19 pandemic. It shut in June 2020. The government actually leased it and turned it into a homeless shelter. And so I'm not sure what the long-term plan is for that, but that's an example of a commercial building being pretty quickly converted to housing use. And I know that shelters are not ideal, but it was needed in the community. And then there's another, this isn't commercial space, but this example is really interesting to me. There's this single room occupancy hotel building in Vancouver called the Burns Block that was gentrified in sort of like after 2006. It was one of those situations that always happens where the owner of this SRO kind of didn't really maintain it properly. The fire department shut it down in 2006. All the tenants had to leave. All the low-income tenants had to leave. The building was flipped, bought by a real estate developer. He converted it into micro suites and rented them out for pretty high rents. And then what happened was, because there was increased homelessness in the downtown East Side because of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I'm saying this, I know this just sounds like this ridiculous situation, but this is actually what happened. The tenants in the rental building were complaining a lot because there were people in front of their building all the time, in some cases sort of like making it hard for them to even get into their building, and there was just a lot of conflict. And people were moving out because of this. The provincial government just bought it and is going to be using it for social housing for low-income people. So come full circle again, and this gentrified building is kind of being returned to the social housing supply. So there have been some properties that have kind of pretty quickly been converted into the use that maybe advocates would hope to see, but I'm not sure if it'll happen on a large scale. We're kind of going to have to see whether people do return to work, how that's going to work out.
Thanks, Jen. So there's one last question in the Q&A, and it's 3:59, so hopefully we can kind of quickly end here and wrap up. And this is a bit of a doozy of a question, I think, or you can go on for a while, so please feel free to tackle it any way you want. But someone was hoping you could expand on your comment that the real estate market and rental housing market are not traditionally linked, and what you think has happened in Vancouver to that change in relationship recently.
Yeah. So what I think happened was just that the price spike was so dramatic that there was also just a lot of speculation at that time, because the price spike was so dramatic. So there was a lot of speculation and investment in real estate in general. So in residential real estate, in condos, in pre-sales and everything. And that also filtered down to the rental market, because suddenly a lot more people weren't able to buy a condo. So they had to stay in the rental market. That pushes the lower income people out of the rental market. It makes it so that it's really, really hard for lower income people to find a place to rent. But what also happened was that it became actually very lucrative to build new rental. That's not a bad thing, actually, because we need more rental supply. And it became lucrative. This was kind of negative, in my opinion. It became very lucrative to like flip these older rental properties. And we were seeing a lot of rent evictions kind of in the period like 2017, 2018. And a lot of those targeted, elderly people who are on fixed incomes like pensions, which was very stressful for them. So we just saw a huge amount of speculative activity in the real estate market.
Thank you very much, Jen, for answering that question. It's 4:01, and we are supposed to stop at 4. But before we do break, I do want to let kind of everyone who's left on the video know that housing topics are one of these things that just sprawl. You've just got 2 people today, and we've talked about everything from kind of accessibility needs, historical policy kind of planks on that, how discrimination kind of normally filters out at a systemic level, homelessness and different homelessness policies across the street, macro kind of economic trends operating on a local level. And kind of when I work on housing, it happens like this kind of in almost every sphere. Issues of zoning, universal design, how you fight discrimination on a practical level. Does it take a year to go to some tribunal, which, obviously if you're disabled and trying to find housing, it's just so easy to do, right? And a lot of these trends happen over decades. I saw an article a few years ago that was talking about how Canada used to spend annually the equivalent of about 25 billion or this huge amount of money on housing, and how today we get far less, and it's kind of crumbs. But because we've had nothing for 30 years, it's kind of all we get. So, there's a large history to housing that, goes all the way from kind of pre-colonization to today. There's all like dozens of different topics. And so you're only able to scratch the surface in a few minutes. But a good deep dive, I strongly recommend, if you haven't already, pick up a copy of this magazine's issue on the topic, which is what today's kind of panel is looking at. And I want to thank our speakers for coming. Both of you, I think, have been given some great information. And I specifically want to thank this magazine for giving us this opportunity to talk about this stuff. Again, it's really important. It's the front and center of just not my life, or folks in Montreal and Vancouver, but again, when I talk to folks in Bogota or Chile or Australia, Sweden, New Zealand, et cetera, you're seeing a lot of the same trends happen globally. So it's a really important discussion for us to have today. Thanks.